Good afternoon. Lekha and I are very proud to present this award on behalf of Ra. Ra has been in existence for about 18 years, and we've done a lot of cultural exchange between India and Great Britain, given scholarships to curators in the British Museum and done events. This is the first time we've had a foray into writing, and we're very pleased that Namita Gokhale and JLF found Tasha for us, and we are so looking forward to seeing her in Jaipur next January. Over to you, Lekha.
Just wanted to continue to say that what Ra Foundation had done over the many years, we'd had about 14 or 15 events, of which about 9 or 10 have been illustrated talks and dance programs and many book launches. And so in a way, the tradition of launching and at least giving this award to a writer is a continuous kind of a thing that we've been doing. We've had a couple of young interns who've come to the British Museum to do curatorship courses. We've given money for all the money that we used to raise for all these events have then gone up to various people. For a lady came in who learned restoration at the Historic Palaces Center. Another one was a calligraphy learning at the V&A. So we've done little events, small donations because we've raised little money. But we're very happy to have Tasha here today, writing her debut book. And congratulations.
It's one of three, isn't it?
At least one of two. We'll see. I've got a mic on here, so.
Are the mics on? Because even though we're a small crowd, I think I don't have the kind of voice that projects. So. Well, first of all, a fervent thank you to the few of you who have come. I knew this was going to happen, that people weren't going to be able to tear themselves away from India, slugging it out with Pakistan down to the nearest pub. I'm sure that's what we have to blame for this. But I was rather hoping it would get rained off, in all honesty.
No, nobody wanted that.
In which case we would have had a much better crowd here. And then I thought, even if we get a crowd, there'll be a gender divide, and it'll be all the men down in the pub and a few women who are staunch supporters of literature and books will be here. But I think that the lure of cricket has been just a little bit too much. Never mind. Welcome to those of you who are here to what I was thinking of in my mind is the ultimate session of the JLF. Ultimate not just in terms of the very last one, but also in terms of the very best. Because, and I've been to numerous festivals internationally actually, both as a writer and as a moderator. And it isn't every day that you get the pleasure of introducing a brand new talent, sort of launching a new star into the literary firmament. And it is actually a very, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, really exciting thing for me as well. And especially because I did enjoy the book. So thank you very much and congratulations from me as well. And I do want to say a word about the RA Foundation. Are you calling it the RA or Ra? Ra. And am I allowed to ask what the R and A stand for, or is Ra just a name? Sun. Ah, okay. So it's not two names put together. Because I am aware that the two of you, and I think you're a partnership of 4 really, have been doing quite a lot of work over the years, and I'm glad you mentioned it. Because Amin Jafar and there's one, Bansri, yes. I think you even helped a writer friend of mine once. So I know you've been doing things, but it's very nice to have a sort of formalized prize in this, and it couldn't be more timely and more meaningful. I wish it had existed in my time when I had been a debut writer, but many, many years ago. But it is actually very timely and very meaningful now, because writers and publishers are really up against it, against this digital revolution, and there's less and less sort of ways in which you can show your appreciation and encouragement, and this I now see as a very important one. And also, just to clarify, is this for South Asian, for people who are of South Asian origin, or is it thematically any book that's linked to South Asia?
I think part of the remit was that we always are, as Ra as a foundation, try to promote culture and education between India and Britain.
Yes, sorry, I should have waited for you to get the mic.
So that was slightly the remit
Right.
for anything. So when we spoke to JLF, we said we'd like to get an author who was subcontinental based probably in the UK, who wrote in English.
Okay.
And we weren't really that worried about the context or the subject of the book.
Oh, so it's going to be more for the author rather than
It's more for the
thematically,
author.
unlike
And
the DSC.
We didn't interfere with the subject of the book at all.
Yeah. Well, you've chosen a very worthy winner. It's a beautifully written book. It's luminous. I don't know how many people, I don't think many people here would have had the chance to read it yet. So you will get a little idea of what the story is about and what the setting is like. But before that, the obligatory biography of the writer. I could actually find very little on Tasha because she is a debut author, and so we don't have the kind of lots of information already there on the internet. So mostly from the page in the book that has the biog, I got that you're born in London to Punjabi parents. You studied English and creative writing at Warwick University. You're a cat-owning librarian. I don't know how much of
a cliche, yes.
stereotype that might form immediately. And it's your love of period Bollywood films, history and mythology that led you to write South Asian influenced fantasies. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, apparently this is quite an interesting fact, so I'll throw it in. My dad used to be a Bollywood actor, very briefly.
Seriously?
Yes, so he was the one who made me interested in Bollywood films. He did one film, came out in 1983. None of you will have seen it, because don't think it did very well, unfortunately. But he always loved...
Commercial cinema or art house?
I think it was art house.
Okay, but do you remember the name?
It was called Tum Log Aao.
Tum Log Aao.
Yeah,
okay.
And he was under the name Nishant, like Madonna, one name only. And it was, so because he was involved in Bollywood in his 30s, he really loved the films and the history and the music, and he worked in radio for many years, and he, would put on all sorts of films like Pakiza and Mughal-e-Azam and, Kagas Ki Phul and things like that. So that inspired me to become interested in Bollywood in the first
And from what age were you watching Bollywood?
Birth, probably.
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah.
Alongside Dad. Yeah.
Because he would just put things on and I would watch them with him.
Okay. Well, I think it might help if we started with a little synopsis of the story of Empire of Sand. So would you like to do that? I had sort of prepared a little synopsis myself, but I think it's much nicer to hear it in the author's own
I'm happy
words.
to do that, yeah. So the book is an epic fantasy inspired by Mughal India. Sorry, my voice is going a little bit. And it's the story of a nobleman's illegitimate daughter who accidentally reveals that she has magic in her blood, and that leads her to being tricked into a marriage and into the service of a semi-immortal, slightly sinister figure, much in the kind of tenets of typical fantasy. But she is able to use magic that is based on the dreams of the gods and is expressed through essentially Bharatanatyam. So it's a very classic fantasy, but also very Indian in its own way.
You don't mention, when you describe that, the Mughal setting, which has been mentioned in, I think, is it in the blurb of the book or on your publisher's website maybe? But that was what first intrigued me, was the idea of a fantasy fiction book with a Mughal setting. Yes. Was that sort of consciously chosen, and how did that work for you?
It was a variety of different things that influenced me. I think anybody who writes knows that you have lots of different influences that come into your head, and you don't always know what they are until you produce something. But I always loved films like Jodha Akbar and Mughal-e-Azam, which drew from the Mughal era in a very broad sense. And I loved the aesthetics of that era, the clothes, the drama, so much the drama, the architecture, all of those kinds of things really inspired me. But I also consciously wanted to draw from Indian history to write fantasy. So I don't know how many of you are fantasy readers, but a lot of fantasy draws on history in different ways. You have sort of very white medieval fantasy, you have things that draw on like different parts of Europe and the Mediterranean, you have Ottoman-inspired fantasy. So I wanted something that was sort of quintessentially South Asian. And the nice thing about the Mughal era is there's a lot of writing about it, because a lot of the Mughals wrote a lot about what they did. They had giant biographies. The Mughal emperors had biographies about their lives because they were quite into their own PR. And you also had missionaries and diplomats coming from Elizabethan courts or Tudor courts and from other European courts who wrote about the Mughal era. So there was a real wealth of information to draw on in fantasy. Typically in fantasy, you're not trying to make everything accurate and perfect and exactly the right historical period. So I know my publishers talk a lot about the 15th century, but I very broadly used the entire Mughal era, so no one could tell me that I was being historically inaccurate, because I'm not trying to be historically accurate, so it's all fine.
It's lovely to have that freedom, but I was actually quite mystified by the publisher's website that mentioned quite specifically 15th century Mughal period, because reading the book I couldn't help thinking it actually goes much further back than that, and I kept thinking, or conversely, there was a point in time when Meher, the chief protagonist, is sort of caught up in the dream fire that I think you might have a small description of it in the reading you've chosen. When she was caught up in that, and I thought that in some ways you've actually catapulted us way ahead in time. And I don't know whether this was, how readers bring their own perception to a book, and you'll soon find out how your book will read differently to different people. But the Extinction Rebellion was going on at the time, and whether that was the reason why I thought, this is very clever. What she's actually done is take us into a time when everything is lost, way ahead of where we are now. And all we have left are the sand dunes and the fire in the sky and this kind of very elemental sort of world.
So you felt like it was set almost in the future?
In the future. Honestly, there was a moment when I thought you're deliberately playing tricks with the setting, and are we going very far back, or have we actually moved so far ahead that there are certain things we recognize, but we're overwhelmed by the heat and the fires and the sky and so on.
I think a lot of fantasy crosses over with science fiction in the sense that it's very symbolic. So to make very broad statements, science fiction tries consciously to go into the future and explore what it means to be human. Fantasy doesn't go into the future, but it does in a variety of very symbological ways. Symbological? Using kind of symbols and myths and things that are in our id, are in our subconscious. It allows us to explore things that concern us and fill us with fear now. So I had a number of people read the book and tell me that I was writing about modern day despots or about climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there is a real theme of imbalance in nature and the way that is damaging the world in the book. And there
was
is...
that intentional? People have mentioned that they thought, like I did, that the book was partially about that. But did you have that in mind at all?
I'm not sure that I think when you're writing a book, you do try and deal with things that concern you and fill you with fear or fill you with anxiety now in fantasy.
Yeah.
So I think there was some element of that, but I didn't go into the book thinking I was writing about climate change or I was writing about rulers who are not very nice to the people that they rule, or people who are living within a system that takes advantage of other people and uses them for to kind of essentially a capitalist system that uses people who are downtrodden in order to feed and fund the people who are in power. That wasn't necessarily intentional, but I do find it interesting that people do read those things into it. Yeah. So the empire within the book is fairly evil, and I've had people sort of read that as a criticism of colonialism and imperialism, and other people have not read it that way. So it's quite interesting the way that people bring their own anxieties to the book in ways that I maybe didn't intend.
Yeah. I know you were concerned also, on the other hand, that by mentioning Mughal on the blurb of the book or in the publicity, that people would expect a kind of Bollywoodized version with all the lush costumes and splendid jewelry and all of that. That is, I mean, you actually steer very firmly away from that kind of a feel, isn't it? That kind of a setting.
I wanted it to have the feel of the Mughal era, and I tried to bring that in with some kind of aesthetics, but I'm also quite conscious that when people write about non-Western worlds in particular, or non-Western settings, they often think that if you say, oh, all the women are wearing saris and they're eating gulab jamun and, you know, that kind of thing, and everybody's doing puja, then it feels Indian, and therefore it is authentic. I personally think that doesn't build authenticity into a story. What it means to be from a specific culture or particular background, or even from a specific geographic area, even in the UK, is under the blood and bone. It is not about aesthetics, it's something else. So even if you talk about, for example, the north of England, you talk about mining towns, you can have everybody eating pork pies. That's really not going to make it authentic. Yeah. It has to be about the pride people have in their inherited sort of work and the fact that people have worked in mines for generations, and those things have influenced people's sense of identity and sense of community, and the impact that has when those things are lost, that isn't about the aesthetics, that's about something deeper. So in this book, I was more concerned about bringing in things that were about the kind of emotional core of, I guess, Indianness that I have within me as someone in the diaspora, into the book, rather than the kind of aesthetics. So I wanted to talk about things like how the main character Meher feels beholden to her family, how she feels she must act in a certain way in order to ensure the honor and the dignity of her own family, while also trying to keep true to herself and to her own mother's traditions, which are at odds with her father's, who is part of the empire. I wanted the sense around what marriage means as a part of a community and part of a family, and what choice means to be really embedded into those things that were part of my own upbringing. So those are the things I focused on.
And that comes across very strongly. I'm probably a lot more rooted in India than you are. So I kept finding parallels and hints. It felt initially like hints, and then I found myself getting drawn into something deeper than that, of the caste system. Because the Amrati people are, these kind of wandering, nomadic people who've been cast out of the empire in a way. So, there was a sense of the caste system coming in, and there was a sense of arranged marriages with the kind of vows that Meher is sort of forced to make, coerced into making. So, I was completely struck by what I think you describe as a feel that's Indian, rather than the saris and the jewelry.
It was quite
detail.
Fun. I don't know if fun is the right word. It was quite lovely to be able to explore those aspects of Indianness, because when you are born and raised here, but you have Indian heritage and you've grown up with that, sometimes you feel as if you're not Indian enough to use your own heritage in your books, but also, so you worry about your own authenticity in your writing. And taking some of the things that I grew up with and putting them into a fantasy setting allowed me to, I guess, kind of explore my own authenticity and my own sense of identity in a way that was quite playful for me.
Brilliantly done then. It's a great way to use your sort of not quite this and not quite that identity. So that's really wonderful. I think maybe a short reading so that our audience also gets a sense of what the book is like and how it feels. And so I know you've picked, do you have the bit that you've chosen?
I have it here.
Page. I know the page you're going to read, but
so
did you want to sort of describe what the background is before you read?
So I'm going to keep it quite short. It's only 5 minutes, I promise. It's quite near the beginning of the book, where the main character Meher, who is the governor's daughter, so she's quite, she lives in quite a lot of privilege and luxury despite the fact that she's illegitimate, has been woken up by a maidservant who says that there is a diver in her sister's room. And at this point, nobody who's reading the book knows what a diver is, so I'm now going to explore that in the book. Okay. "There's no need for this, my lady," the guardswoman said. "Lady Arwa simply had a nightmare, I'm sure of it." "Are you?" Meher replied mildly. The guardswoman hesitated, then said, "I told Lady Arwa's nursemaid and the maidservants that diver don't exist, that they should tell her so, but..." She paused, glancing uneasily at Meher's face. "The Irin is superstitious." Meher returned her look. This one, she thought, has not been in Arena long. "I ran into the room as soon as she screamed," said the guard, pressing on despite Meher's pointed silence. "I saw nothing." Ignoring her, Meher nudged Arwa gently with her foot. "Go on, love, show me where it is." Arwa took in another deep breath and stood straight, mustering up her courage. Then she went into her bedroom. Meher followed close behind her, the guardswoman still hovering at her back. "There," Arwa said, pointing. "It's moved on the window ledge." Meher looked up and found the diver already watching her. Pale dawn was coming in through the window lattice at its back. Silhouetted against it, the diver was a wisp of taloned shadows, its wings bristling darkly against a backdrop of grey-gold light. It was small for a diver, no larger than Arwa, with nothing human in the shape of its face or in the lidless glare of its golden eyes. "Stay where you are, Arwa," Meher said. "Just lift the lamp higher." Meher walked towards it, slowly, so as not to startle it from its perch. The diver's eyes followed her with the constancy of prayer flames. 3 floors above the ground, Behind heavily guarded walls, nothing should have been able to reach Arwa's chambers, but Diva didn't obey the rules of human courtesy, and there were no walls in Jairina that could keep it out of a place it wanted to be. Still, Meher's gut told her this Diva was not dangerous. Curious, perhaps, but not dangerous. Just to be sure, she held her hands in front of her, arms crossed, her fingers curled into a sigil to ward against evil. The Diva didn't so much as flinch. Good. "What are you doing?" whispered Arwa. "Speaking," said Meher. "Hush now." She drew her hands close together, thumbs interlocked, fanning out her fingers in the old sigil for bird. The Diva rustled its wings in recognition. It knew its name when it saw it. "Ah," breathed Meher. Her heart was beating fast in her chest. "You can move now, love. There's nothing to be afraid of." "It still looks like it wants to bite me," Arwa said warily. "It's a bird spirit," Meher said. "That's what birds do. But there's nothing evil inside it. It's a simple creature. It won't hurt you." She took another step closer. The Diva cocked its head. She could smell the air around it, all humid sweetness like incense mingled with water. She sucked in a deep breath and resisted the urge to set her fingers against the soft shadows of its skin. She held a palm out. "Go." But there was no compulsion behind the movement, and the Diva did not look at all inclined to move. It watched her expectantly. Its nostrils, tucked in the shadows of its face, flared wide. It knew what she was, and it was waiting. Meher drew the dagger from her sash. Arwa gave a squeak, and behind them the guardswoman startled into life, drawing the first inch of her sword out with a hiss of steel. "Calm, calm," said Meher soothingly. "I'm just giving it what it wants." She pressed the sharp edge of her dagger to her left thumb. The skin gave way easily, a bead of blood rising to the surface. She held her thumb up for the Diva. It lowered its head, smelling her blood. Okay.
Without wishing to split hairs, but if we are to believe that the setting is Mughal times, it's a time when religion abounded, isn't it? You had Hinduism and Islam, and
Yes.
obviously not as divided as it became later in British times, but they were all around. And you've created these intriguing figures that you pronounce it Daiva. There's something like the Hindu devas. You would imagine they were going to be something like that, but they aren't. And then I couldn't figure out whether, for a long time, through most of the book, whether they were evil creatures or good, benevolent sort of spirits. And Meher obviously has a connection with them. And where did all that come from?
That, I thought I was being very creative and just drawing it from the air. That isn't true, though, unfortunately.
Isn't it?
So in the world building, I very consciously did not want to bring in Hinduism or Islam or Sikhism. I think partly because those are so very much part of our real world, and there are very contentious ideologies surrounding what was going on in the Mughal era in terms of the interaction between different religions. So there was a lot of contention, for example, around a book about Aurangzeb that came out last year. Whether he was a despot or not is a very contentious subject, and I wanted to avoid all of that. That wasn't something that interested me. Instead, I wanted to take the symbolism and narratives of Hinduism that I grew up with, take them out of that context and use them as the backdrop or the inspiration for the magic. So the Daiva were inspired by devas, by gods, and I just wanted to have these mythological figures that humans were descended from, or certain groups of humans were descended from, much like, you had people who were the children of gods in Hinduism and in many other world faiths. But I also wanted the Daiva to be a little bit like jinn. So a lot of people think that I'm writing about jinn rather than devas, but it's meant to be sort of a mash between both, or a fusion, let's say, and sort of bringing in that kind of symbolism or that universal concept of these otherworldly beings that are not quite gods and not quite humans, that have an interaction with humans and are not always benign or not always good or evil.
In the business of creating fantasy, it seems very important for you to use the unfamiliar to explain the familiar, and the other way around sometimes. It sort of seems to work both ways. And you mentioned the word authenticity a little while ago, and I'm not that, I don't write fantasy myself, and I'm not as much of an expert at the genre as you probably are in terms of reading. But I wondered how much you need to use authenticity to create these kind of fantastic. How important is it for you to base your fantasy on authenticity, because the two would almost seem to be contradictory to each other, if you see what I mean. If authenticity and fantasy seem like two completely opposite ends of a certain spectrum.
I mean, I don't want to make any kind of universal statements, because the approach that different authors take to speculative fiction is vast. There are authors who don't care if something feels real or authentic. They want to create something that is hyper unrealistic, and that is an approach that people take. It's an approach many literary authors take as well. But for me, and I think for a number of other authors who want to reach a wide audience, authenticity is very important. But when I'm talking about authenticity, it isn't that it feels so familiar that it's like you could have done it and gone and got, like the characters go get milk down at the corner store kind of deal. It's about the emotional core of the story feeling real, so you can put yourself into that character's shoes and walk with them. This is something that superhero films do very well, for example. So you care about these characters who can blow things up and have superpowers, because essentially at the heart they're like the rest of us. They have the same vulnerabilities, and they care about their families or their loved ones. They fall in love, or they fear that somebody may die, or they fear that they will die. And it's important for those fears and those desires to feel like the fears and desires that we have.
To be recognizable.
Yes, but on a much larger stage.
Yeah.
And I think once you've made that first step of making those feelings authentic, you can take people a very long way, and they're willing to go with you. So Meher, who's the heroine of this book, her desires are very simple actually. She wants to hold on to her mother's heritage, her mother who has been exiled or has left her. This is somewhat of a question at the beginning. But holding on to her mother's heritage puts her at odds with the family that she lives with, and that puts her in a very difficult position. So she has to sort of put on one face with certain people and a different face with others, and that is, I think, something we're all familiar with having to do in different circumstances. And she also wants to do the right thing most of the time.
She's very relatable. I found myself rooting for her more and more strongly as the story went along. And you really do worry for her and want things to work out for her. But I think that was the thing I was trying to get to, is that are there limits to a reader's imagination? So you as a fantasy writer, do you have to be aware of the fact that there are, all said and done, and I know you're saying you don't write the kind of fantasy where people just let all of that. I mean, should one suspend disbelief and just go along with the ride and enjoy it? Or should one be searching the way I seemed to be doing for something that I could hook onto, something that I could relate to, credibility, authenticity, all those kind of qualities?
I think it depends what you look for in a book. It really does.
It's down to
like I said, authenticity is very important for me. I wanted the reader to be able to go with Meher, walk with her right to the end of her journey. That was very important, because in many ways, though you have this magic and you have all these evil figures and you have all of these adventures going on, in the end, the heart of the story is about an emotional journey. Most stories at their heart are an emotional journey, and I wanted the reader to go with her the whole way. But I do think that there are readers and authors who go into speculative fiction on a very broad level looking for very different things. So there is a lot of...
It's strange you should say that, because I just literally, day before yesterday, just as I was winding up, getting my questions ready, I had an invitation from, and I get lots of invitations from publishers in India, from your own publishers in India actually, Hachette India, who are I think quite separate to the ones over here, inviting me to a session on speculative fiction, and I thought, what on earth is speculative fiction? So I went, and they were all women, female writers actually, there were 4 of them. Went into the invitation to sort of investigate more, and it seemed to be not that different to science fiction. And I thought, are these separate genres? Is it just a new name for science fiction?
It's contentious. It is contentious. So speculative fiction is a way of referring to anything that is fiction that questions reality. So you can imagine that's very broad. That can cross over with many different things. Sometimes I think there's a critique that people use the term speculative fiction to hide that it's science fiction and fantasy. I mean, if it's a dragon, you know it's fantasy. You can call it speculative fiction all you want. Yeah. People know what they're getting into. But I quite like the term because it's very broad and it covers a wide variety of things. So usually you wouldn't say put Ian McEwan under science fiction or fantasy, but then he's written Machines Like Me, so I would call that speculative fiction. Margaret Atwood, again, is another one who I would say is speculative, and it brings us all together under an umbrella so that I can talk about it broadly. But so that's essentially what speculative fiction is.
It's a broad church, isn't it?
Yes, a very broad church.
You're probably aware that fantasy fiction is still relatively untapped in India, which is why I'm so excited that you're actually going to Jaipur, because I think it could be the start of a new kind of interest that India, or another option for Indian readers. Because what you get when you Google in Indian fantasy fiction, what you get taken to are the stories of Ram and Ravan and Sita. It's a mythological fiction, basically, being written by writers like Amish Tripathi and Anand Neelakantan. Are these two distinct categories? Again, it's
Yes.
like you mentioned, they are.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not a continuum, which is...
No, I think in the end, the kind of mythological fiction is religious fiction, isn't it? Because it's talking about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and things that are
the
very...
stories have come from there. But
Yes.
could Valmiki and Vyasa and Tulsidas just be our first speculative writers, fiction writers? Maybe that's where the stories came from, imagination.
I guess we're calling it a broad church. So yes, we can say within speculative fiction, perhaps they come under there. But I do think it's very distinct because although I've drawn on Hindu influences in my life, it isn't Hindu fiction, nor is it Muslim fiction. It is a fantasy that draws on symbology that exists in the culture. Whereas I do think that a lot of the mythological fiction, because it draws from religious stories and has religious figures as characters, has religious significance. Whether that is, you'll be familiar with these stories and I'm going to go and do my own thing with them, or whether it's sticking very closely to the original text, it still has a humongous religious dimension. And I think it leans more towards being, therefore, religious/theological fiction rather than science fiction or fantasy. But I say that out of respect for the source text rather than any desire to say, no, it doesn't have any place alongside fantasy, because there is a connection, but I think it leans more that way. But there was a really interesting article done online by an author called Mimi Mondal, who wrote about the history of science fiction and fantasy in India. And she wrote a really beautiful thing. If you look up her name and you look up the history of Indian science fiction, you'll find it. And she talked about a lot of the work that's been done outside of mythological fiction. And
it doesn't seem to be very much.
There isn't very much, but she sort of picked up on a little bit.
Okay.
And there are a few authors writing now who are doing some really interesting things. So there's Indra Pramit Das, who has written a book called The Devourers, which is also set in Mughal India. It is much darker than my book, I will say.
Oh, really?
But it's very interesting, very, very dark. And Hachette India just had a book out, an anthology called Magical Women, which was a little, it brought together lots of short stories by a number of different Indian women writers about fantasy. So there are little things happening.
The little things bubbling up.
Yeah.
That's good, because you're in which case, but I think, you're, with the kind of platform you'll get in Jaipur, I think yours is probably going to be considered one of the first fantasy fiction books that is not mythological fiction, because I think, and I worry on behalf of those writers, because it sort of surprises me that they haven't run into trouble yet, given that they are telling much loved stories of our beloved gods and heroes. It sort of feels to me like it's only a little matter of time before which one of them will put a step wrong, and then there'll be all kinds of controversy and problems.
I imagine that's a distinct possibility.
Do you find yourself self-censoring? If you think you might put something into your book, and do you find yourself thinking, oh, I'm not sure how that'll go down with readers, especially in India?
I guess I don't have to worry about India too much because I'm not based there.
You're going there.
I am going there, yes. But if they want to come all the way to the Jaipur Literature Festival to tell me off, they're very welcome to do that. I don't worry about it that much. I worry in a very specific sense about writing stories that might cause harm to marginalized groups or to people who do not usually get to see themselves in stories. So even though there is a lot more getting published today, there are still not that many South Asian descent writers in the Western world putting books out. And if I wrote something that caused a lot of harm, I would be quite mad at myself for that, and I would try and rectify that in future books. I don't worry about people critiquing my use of, say, Hindu belief or even history, because they can say what they want. I'm a writer. I'm just trying to do an entertaining story that uses those things that are also mine in a way that is meaningful. So as long as the critique isn't about actual harm that I've caused, I'm not too concerned.
Good, well said. I read an article in The Guardian quite recently actually about sexism in fantasy fiction specifically. This was quite interesting. There's a writer called Samantha Shannon who said that, I don't know whether it happened to her particularly, but she was quoted as saying that books by women tend to get dispatched to the young adult or children's section in the bookshops, whereas the fantasy fiction that's taken seriously and put sometimes on a pedestal. I mean, you wouldn't sneeze at names like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and they've all got their sort of cult followings amongst grown-ups as well, even if they're read by children, Philip Pullman and Neil Gaiman and all these people. But is that true? I mean, do you think that there is some truth in that, and have you come up against this kind of prejudice at all?
I'm in a funny position because this is a debate that comes up a lot at the moment, because my work is marketed as crossover. I want it to appeal to young women and young men as well as adult readers. So I don't mind when people say my work is teen fiction. It's not marketed directly at teens, but if they read it, I'm quite happy with that. Hopefully their parents have vetted it first. Maybe not. But there is definitely a strong trend where women writers who are writing adult fantasy that is very definitely not aimed at children are confused or are viewed as writers for children. So, for example, a book came out in 2018 called The Poppy War, which was based on specifically the Nanking Massacre in China. To anybody who knows history, it is an extremely gruesome and tragic part of world history.
They had mass rapes and mass
killings. Yes, extremely horrible. And the author goes into it in huge detail. She was 19 when it was published, when she was contracted, and she is a historian herself and is studying history and wanted to explore that and explore the trauma of that in her own writing. So, but because she is a young female writer, sometimes people suggest this book to teenagers.
I don't believe it.
Honestly, it's a book that sickened me, and it was intended to. That is the intent of the book. I would not give it to a teenager, and yet it's still, people will look at the author and they will assume that this is a book that should be read by children. And those kind of cases I find really reveal a kind of a sexism or a bias in the way that people interpret books. Yeah. Like my book, it's fine, give it to a teenager. Do not give that book to a teenager. You know.
You're right. Yours could cross over quite easily, I think. I'm seeing the sign flashing saying 5 minutes left. So I'll just ask you one more question, then we'll open it up in case people here have questions as well. But it's in a way bringing us back to the Ra Foundation and the prize that's so specific to South Asian writers and themes. And I wondered whether you could say something about these, the diversity schemes that publishers are now. Penguin Random House, I think, was the first one to start the Right Now program, which is sort of recognizing. I think your own publishers have a similar scheme as well, called Changing the Story. I think it's called. They've all got their own little monikers for the schemes they have, the diversity schemes, aiming to, rightly so, change the kind of books they're commissioning, the kind of people who are commissioning the books, just try and recognize the fact that they haven't taken into account vast sections of the population who are actually reading and not finding the kind of books that might reflect their own experiences and lives. There was also the anticipated backlash when Lionel Shriver, did she describe it as virtue signaling? I think she accused Penguin Random House of being drunk on virtue.
She said something along the lines of, and I'm sure somebody else can find the exact quote, that they would publish any quality book if it was written by a gay disabled Somali person.
Yeah, she actually said the thing about lesbians who were disabled. And she does she's yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think she's
a bit of a contrarian.
She curries on controversy, let's say. So
it was a bit cheeky that she won the Women's Prize, which was set up to recognize the fact that women were not being recognized at the major literary prizes.
I think if you're the kind of person who has that view, perhaps you shouldn't be accepting a prize specifically for women, but
Right. But more worryingly, Pat Barker said something similar as well more recently, and I think she said she was suspicious of diversity schemes.
I can understand suspicion of diversity schemes in the sense that they need to have follow through. So I believe that the people who are running these schemes are determined to improve the face of representation in literature at the moment. Even a brief glance at the statistics around children's publishing show that publishing is not representative of the population of the country. I think these schemes are important. They need follow through. If the critique of the schemes is that they are just virtue signaling, I think the fact that there are people who need these schemes and utilize them and will hopefully do very well from them shows that perhaps they are not that. There was a very interesting quote from somebody whose name I can't remember, which is very bad, that when you've always been privileged, equality feels like being denied rights or something along those lines. It was much more pithy than what I just said, but if you've always been the one who gets the contracts, the one who gets put in the bookshops, if you're suddenly told, but now these other people also need an opportunity, you may feel as if you're being denied something that you earned. And I can understand that, but it's wrong. And people maybe need to calm down slightly, I think. Yes.
Quite right. Is there anything that anyone here would like to ask Tasha?
Are you interested with your Bollywood background in having this book
Use the
appeal
mic.
to a Bollywood producer or director?
It's been optioned in America, so
It's interesting, yeah.
So
I haven't read it sadly, but
so we'll see what happens. But
yeah.
yeah, it wasn't intended to be aimed at getting interest from Bollywood or anything like that.
No,
So.
just a question, because you had a history of Bollywood in your background.
No writer would say no to a Bollywood.
No, I wouldn't say
film
no. No, sorry.
Coming back to Lion and Shriver, she doesn't really mean, she says it in a very thumping way, but there are people who think diversity for its own sake is also pointless, like reservations in colleges.
I know people have stronger feelings about that, but as somebody not in India, I don't feel very comfortable, you know.
Lion and Land rights here.
Yes.
There's a hand that went up there as well. So then the mic is, it's with you.
I just wanted to ask you, as somebody of sort of Asian origin growing up in England, I think this is, a population or a section of society that should be represented because, you know, we are very much part of this conversation today. But what I want to know is how much oral folk literature of the subcontinent, and I'm talking about this whole area, did you grow up with? Because sort of if you grew up, not even people from my generation, not your generation, we grew up with grandmothers and, you know, telling us all these stories, and they're very much like your book. They are this kind of line between reality and not reality, and they're not Marquez, but they are about things happening to you, or things coming from the top, or the unreal being taken as true. And it'd be interesting to know whether you heard any of those stories.
Yes. When I think about the stories I had as a child, I grew up with my nanny-ma raising me a lot of the time, my mother's mother. So she looked after me during the day. Sorry. And she would tell me lots of different stories. The stories that have stuck with me, possibly because I'm slightly morbid, maybe not her fault, the trauma stories, the stories of things like partition. And all of those really reflect, I think, the only way that she could express those to me were almost in a folkloric way. She had to give me part of the truth, but not the whole truth. So there were always elements of it that never felt quite real. And I think that was the only way that she could tell me those stories without the pain of the barefaced truth, I suppose. So when I think of the folkloric inheritance, part of that is a kind of a folkloric trauma inheritance, which sounds quite dark, but actually something I very much appreciated. Stories about things that she grew up with, I mean, like actual folkloric stories, I don't think I really got. It was more stories of her own childhood and things that I would never be able to be sure are true or not, really. And we watched a lot of religious television shows together. So that had a big influence on me as well.
So you didn't read any of the accounting folklore stories that, say, Ramanujan has collected?
No, I read the Panchatantra. Sorry. That's the only one.
Yeah.
We talk about trauma, and I think trauma, partition trauma
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I haven't read the book yet, but
That's okay.
It is available, I think, in the bookshop.
yes, the reason I'm here is because my daughter wants to be an author when she grows up, and I just wanted to get a sense of. I was interested to see when you talked about how it might appeal to young adults as well, teens and young adults as well, and I wondered whether, with a sense of sort of, did you have a message overall, sort of, that you wanted young adults or teens to take away from the book? Or any message that you thought would be the sort of central message of the book?
I think I always joke that the story, the key heart of the book is that the power of love will conquer all, because it's so cheesy, but it's also true. I think what I wanted to bring into the book that I hope teen readers would take away is that there are lots of ways to be strong. So the main character goes through quite significant suffering, and she doesn't always get to, kick butt and fight back, because sometimes it's impossible to do that for a variety of reasons, and that happens also in our real lives. So what I wanted to show was that her strength, her survival, her making choices in circumstances where there are no good choices, was a demonstration of who she was as a person, and was a sign of her goodness, I suppose, and is something to be valued. And I think that is a message that we don't often get when we are teenagers or adults, that there are many ways to be strong that do not just require us to fight in a very specific kind of heroic manner.
I loved her self-belief. I really thought that came across so strongly and so beautifully, because she's also quite a gentle person.
Yes.
And yet a fighter, and that sort of, it might sound unreal for us to just mention these attributes sitting over here, but the character comes across beautifully, and she is what propels the story forward. Certainly did for me. So there was a hand that went up somewhere here as well, I think. Did you have a question?
I suppose I was just thinking, you were talking about, you're clearly quite a thoughtful person, you've thought about feminism and power and stuff like that. My question's really about the idea of kind of more speculative fiction, maybe coming out of India or whatever. Do you think maybe speculative fiction is a way of telling truth that you can't tell directly?
Oh yes, you said it better than I could, honestly. There are some amazing writers of science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction who are really exploring reality and power and colonialism and slavery in really fascinating and kind of gut-wrenching ways. So N.K. Jemisin is an author who's written the Broken Earth series, which I guarantee you is going to be bigger than Game of Thrones, in my view. And it deals with questions of climate change and power in really fascinating and creative and cool ways. But it's also like nothing I've ever read before, and it deals with truths about the way the world works in a way that I kind of think you couldn't if you put it into the context of reality. Because when you talk about the American history of slavery, for example, if you talk about America, people will bring their own preconceptions to that book and to that story. Whereas by putting it in a completely weird setting, she forces you to confront truths and reality in ways that you just wouldn't if you were reading realistic fiction. Which isn't to say that realistic fiction can't do amazing and very cool things, but as somebody who loves fantasy and science fiction, I'm of course going to big up its qualities.
I'm being told we could have one more question if there is one that you have. We didn't get time for our second reading, unfortunately.
It's okay.
But if there isn't another question, then I think I want to ask you about book 2, because I know there's an intriguing chapter for the next one, and then
yes.
I didn't actually read it because I wanted to wait for to be able to read the whole book and just get carried along.
Well, there is another book coming out.
There is, yes.
Very
soon, is it?
In November 2019, so
okay.
This November, yes.
Oh, good, soon.
Yes, and it's called Realm of Ash, so we've tried to keep up the Realm of Ash, trying to keep
Same
up the titles. It's taking one character from the first book. Okay. So you can definitely read the second book without having read the first book. Though it will help if you've read the first one.
Yes,
certainly.
Well, I wish you lots of luck with that.
Thank you.
With your writing career, which lies ahead of you, with Jaipur.
Did you have difficulty getting a publisher?
No, but it took me a long time to get to the point where I felt confident enough to actually attempt to get published. I didn't know that anybody would want my work or the kind of stories I was writing. But once I actually started reaching out and looking at the information that was available online, the process was actually quite smooth. It didn't feel smooth, it felt very traumatic, but it was okay once I got there. Congratulations. Thank you.
Yes, congratulations and thank you. Thank you.